The arrow meant for Silas Brooks's throat never found him, because an orc woman's hand axe took the archer through the chest first. Silas hit the dirt hard, his surveying chains tangling around his boots, the brass sighting scope he'd spent 3 years saving for skittering into the underbrush. Above him, the forest exploded into motion, men in mismatched leathers dropping from the rocks where they'd been waiting since dawn, men who had watched him mark his stakes and string his lines along the ridge, and decided a lone mapmaker with a fat purse of survey fees was easier prey than honest work. There had been 4 of them. Now there were 3, and the 4th was on his back in the leaf litter with an axe buried to the haft in him, and the woman who had thrown it was already moving. She came out of the tree line like something the forest itself had decided to spit out, and Silas, flat on his back with his heart trying to beat its way out of his ribs, could not look away from her even as a second man swung a rusted blade at his skull. She was orc, and she was enormous in the way that made the men around her look like boys playing at soldiers, all corded muscle beneath skin the deep green-gray of river stone, black hair bound back in a single thick braid that whipped behind her like a war banner. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and supple, a laced hide bodice cinched tight at her waist that did nothing to hide the powerful lines of her shoulders and the curve beneath them, trousers tucked into high boots scarred from years of hard country, a broad belt at her hip still holding one more axe and a long hunting knife. Tusks, small and sharp, showed white at the corners of her mouth when she snarled, and her eyes, Silas would remember this even through the terror, were a startling amber, lit gold where the morning sun cut through the pines. "Down," she barked at him, in accented but clear common speech, and he went down without arguing, pressing his face into the dirt as she closed the last few strides and put her boot into the swordsman's knee hard enough that Silas heard the joint give from 6 feet away. The man screamed. She did not let him finish before her fist caught him under the jaw and dropped him boneless into a fern bed. The third man ran. She let him. The whole thing had taken perhaps 20 seconds. Silas lay in the leaves with his ears ringing and his hands shaking, and when he finally looked up she was standing over him, breathing hard, one hand still wrapped around the haft of her remaining axe, watching him the way a wolf watches something it has not yet decided is worth eating. "You are the mapmaker," she said. It was not a question. "Fool. Bandits mark surveyors before surveyors mark land. Everyone in the border towns knows this. You did not. I knew it was a risk." His voice came out thinner than he wanted. He was 31 years old and had walked the wild borderlands with a chain and a compass for 6 years, and he had never once had cause to be grateful to an orc, because he had never once had cause to speak to one for longer than it took to trade wary nods across a fence line. He got his knees under him, then his feet brushing leaf mold from his coat with hands that would not quite stop trembling. "I'm grateful, more than grateful. You saved my life." "I know." She said it flatly, without pride, already turning to retrieve her axe from the dead man's chest. She wrenched it free with a wet sound Silas tried not to think too hard about, wiped the blade on the corpse's shirt, and slid it back into its loop at her hip. "Go home, mapmaker. Tell the town council to pay better men to guard their surveyors, or better yet, to stop drawing lines through country that is not theirs to draw lines through." Wait. He didn't know why he said it. Every instinct that 6 years of frontier life had beaten into him said to let her walk away, to be grateful and silent, and gone before she changed her mind about whatever mercy had made her intervene at all. But something in the flat, tired way she'd said "I know" made him reach into his coat instead, fingers closing around the small leather purse of coin he carried for exactly these situations, the ones where a man's life was worth more than his savings. "Let me pay you, for what you did. That's a debt. I don't walk away from debts." She turned back and looked at him properly for the first time, head to foot, and something flickered behind the gold of her eyes that might have been surprise, might have been contempt, might have been something else entirely that he had no name for yet. "Keep your coin," she said. "I did not save you for coin." And then quieter, almost to herself. I do not know why I saved you at all. She was gone into the trees before he could find an answer to that, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for someone her size, and Silas Brooks stood alone in a clearing with two unconscious bandits, one dead one, and a strange hollow feeling in his chest that he would spend the next several weeks trying and failing to name. He found out her name 3 days later in the border town of Kestrel's Crossing, from the mouth of a man who spat when he said it. "Vola Thunderroar," said the blacksmith, a broad, sunburned man named Odell who was fitting new shoes to Silas's survey mare. "Lives out past Bitter Ridge alone in that old trapper's cabin nobody else wanted. Orc woman. You want to steer well clear of her, Brooks, if you're smart. Word is her own clan cast her out for some black business back east, years gone. A woman thrown out by her own kind, you don't want to know what she did to earn that." "She saved my life," Silas said. Odell's hammer paused mid-swing. "Did she now?" "Bandits up on the ridge line. She killed one, crippled another, and never asked for a copper piece for the trouble." Silas kept his voice level, though something in him bristled at the way the blacksmith's mouth had curled at the mention of her name, the easy contempt of a man who had clearly never spoken 2 words to the woman he was condemning. "Seemed to me like a decent sort, whatever she did or didn't do east of here." "Decent." Odell snorted and went back to his hammering. "You mapmakers see too much open country and not enough sense. Ask the sheriff about Thunderroar clans sometime. Ask him what a chieftain's cast-out daughter is capable of." Silas didn't ask the sheriff. But he thought about her amber eyes and the tired way she'd said, "I do not know why I saved you at all." And 3 weeks later, when his survey work took him out along Bitter Ridge to chart the boundary lines the town council had commissioned him to mark, he found himself steering his mare not away from her cabin, but toward it, with a jar of honey and a sack of flour tied behind his saddle, telling himself it was only the settling of a debt and knowing, even as he told himself that it was a lie. The cabin sat in a hollow below the ridge, small and weathered gray, a lean-to for a single goat, a garden plot turned with more care than Silas expected, rows of beans and roots pushing up green against the dark soil. Vola Thunderroar was standing in the doorway with a wood axe in her hand before he'd even gotten his mare to a full stop, and the sight of her in daylight, unhurried, not mid-battle, hit him harder than he expected. She had washed the blood from her leathers since he'd seen her last. The lace bodice sat snug over a figure that was all coiled strength and unapologetic curve, her braid falling over one shoulder, tusks catching the afternoon light when her lip curled at the sight of him. "You," she said, "the fool mapmaker. You have a talent for finding trouble, or trouble has a talent for finding you. I came to pay my debt." He dismounted slowly, hands visible, the way he'd learned to move around anything wild and wary, be it deer or dog or apparently orc. "Not coin. I remembered you said no to that. Flour, honey, some salt pork. It isn't much, but it's honest, and I don't like owing anyone anything I haven't tried to repay." Vola stared at him for a long moment, axe still loose in her grip, and then something in her shoulders eased, just slightly, just enough that Silas let himself breathe again. "You rode 2 hours out from the crossing to bring an orc a sack of flour," she said, and there was something almost like amusement threading under the flatness of her voice now. "The men of your town would call that madness. The men of my town weren't the ones bleeding on a ridge line 3 weeks ago." He held the sack out. "I'm Silas Brooks. I chart the border for the town council, mostly boundary lines and water rights, sometimes trade roads. I've been doing it 6 years, and I've never once had a reason to think an orc was anything other than what the stories said. Then you put an axe through a man's chest to save my life and asked for nothing after, and now I've got a reason to wonder if the stories are worth much at all." She took the sack from him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Silas felt it like a spark jumping a gap, quick and startling, and from the way Vola's amber eyes flicked to his hand and back to his face, she had felt it too. "Vola," she said. "Vola Thunderroar. Since you did not ask, and since you clearly intend to keep coming back until I tell you, so that you may stop calling me the orc woman in your head like every other soft-footed man in that town does. Vola. He said it carefully, like he was handling something that might break or bite. It's a good name. It was my mother's name before it was mine. She set the sack down inside the doorway, propped her axe against the frame, and looked at him with an assessing frankness that made his neck go warm. You should not come back here, Silas Brooks. Your town does not love orcs, and orcs who live near your town do not love being visited by curious men with soft hands and softer hearts. I've got calluses, he said, holding up a palm scarred from years of chain and stake and compass, and I'm not sure my heart's soft so much as stubborn. I'll come back when the survey brings me this way. That's not visiting. That's business. Is it? Vola's mouth curved just slightly, just enough to show the edge of one tusk, and something in that almost smile undid a knot in Silas's chest that had been tight for longer than he cared to admit. Then I look forward to your business, mapmaker. He rode back to Kestrel's crossing with the sunset at his back, and a foolish grin he couldn't wipe off his face. And he told himself again that it was only the settling of a debt. It was not only the settling of a debt, and both of them knew it long before either said so aloud. Over the following weeks, Silas's survey work along Bitter Ridge became, by some coincidence he did not examine too closely, work that required a great many trips past the little cabin in the hollow. He brought supplies each time: a length of good rope, a new whetstone, a jar of preserves his landlady had pressed on him, and each time Vola met him at the door with her axe less ready in her hand, until eventually she stopped bringing it at all and simply stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and that wary, considering look on her face, as though she were still deciding what to make of him and hadn't quite finished the accounting. They talked. That was the thing Silas hadn't expected, that a woman capable of putting an axe through a bandit's chest without flinching would also be the kind of conversationalist who could hold him at her fence line for 2 hours discussing the migration patterns of the mountain elk, or the foolishness of the kestrels crossing town council, or the way the wind came down off the high passes different in autumn than in spring. She was sharp-tongued and quick to mock his soft hands, his careful surveyor's notebooks, the way he apologized to his horse when he forgot to bring an apple. But she laughed too, a real laugh, low and startled out of her like she wasn't used to using it, and each time she did Silas felt it land somewhere under his ribs and stay there. He learned in pieces that she had come to Bitter Ridge 3 years past, alone, from somewhere far to the east, and that she never spoke of what had come before beyond a tightness around her eyes that told him not to ask. He learned that she hunted her own meat, grew her own vegetables, traded pelts twice a year at a trading post 2 days' ride distant because Kestrel's crossing would not serve her, and that she had not spoken to another living soul for longer than an hour at a time in all the years since she'd built that cabin, until him. He learned, too, the particular danger of an orc woman's eyes when she looked at him a certain way across a fire, the particular danger of her voice pitched low and rough with something that was not anger, the particular danger of his own heart, which had apparently decided, somewhere in those weeks of flour sacks and elk migrations, that it belonged to her. The reckless night came in early autumn, when a storm blew down off the mountains faster than either of them had any right to be caught by. Silas had ridden out to finish charting the last stretch of ridge line before winter closed the passes, and Vola had come out to walk the boundary with him, ostensibly because she did not trust his sense of direction in unfamiliar country, though they both knew by then it was an excuse neither one needed any more. The sky had been clear at midday. By late afternoon it had gone the color of a bruise, and by the time the first fat drops of rain began to fall, they were a mile from her cabin and running, laughing despite themselves, her hand closing hard around his wrist to pull him along faster as thunder cracked directly overhead. They made the cabin soaked to the skin, and Vola barred the door against the howling wind while Silas fumbled the fire back to life, and for a long moment they simply stood there dripping onto her floorboards, breathless, grinning at each other like fools. "Your maps are ruined," she said, nodding at the satchel he'd tried and failed to keep dry. "My maps can be redrawn." He was looking at her, at the way her wet hair had come loose from its braid and clung to her jaw, at the way her leathers had gone dark and molded to her like a second skin, at the amber of her eyes gone soft and unguarded in the firelight in a way he had never seen before. "Some things can't." Vola went very still. "Silas, I know what you're going to say." He took a step closer anyway, because 6 years of careful surveying had taught him to read terrain, to know when ground was solid enough to bear weight, and every instinct in him said this ground would hold. "You're going to say I should go home before the storm gets worse, or that your town doesn't love orcs and mine doesn't either, or that this is a foolish thing for a mapmaker and an exile to want. You're right about all of it. I don't care." "You should care," she said, but her voice had dropped low and rough, and she had not stepped back. "I have killed men, Silas Brooks. I have blood on my hands that will never wash clean, and a name that no town wants spoken kindly, and a clan that cast me out for reasons I have told no one. I am not a soft thing for a soft-hearted mapmaker to love." "I never said you were soft." He reached up slowly, giving her every chance to step away, and brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. Her breath caught, audible even over the drumming rain. "I said I didn't care. There's a difference, Vola. I've seen what you are. I saw it the first day, when you put an axe through a man's chest to save a stranger who'd never done a thing for you. That's not a reason to run from you. That's the reason I keep coming back." She made a sound low in her throat, something between a growl and a groan, and then her hands were fisted in the front of his shirt, and she was pulling him against her with a strength that lifted him half onto his toes. And the kiss that followed was not gentle, not careful, not anything like the soft-footed courting his town would have recognized. It was hunger and relief, and 3 months of careful distance breaking all at once, her tusks catching faintly at his lip, his hands finding the curve of her waist through wet leather, and when they finally broke apart both of them were breathing like they'd run the ridge line twice. "If I let you stay tonight," she said against his mouth, voice ragged, "there is no undoing it. My people mark such things, body and word both, you understand this." "I understand." His hands were shaking, but not from fear. "I don't want it undone, Vola. I haven't wanted anything this much in my whole life." She looked at him for one more long moment, searching his face for the lie that wasn't there, and then she kissed him again, softer this time, achingly so, and drew him toward the fire and the furs piled near it. And the storm howled outside the cabin walls, while inside, for the first time in 3 years, Vola Thunderroar was not alone, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, neither was Silas Brooks. What passed between them that night was tender where he had feared she might be fierce, and fierce where he had never dared to hope, her hands careful on him despite their strength, his patient and searching despite his nerves, and when it was done they lay tangled together in the firelight with the storm settling to a gentle patter on the roof, and Vola pressed her mouth to his shoulder and said something low in her own tongue, words he didn't understand, spoken like a vow. "What does that mean?" he asked, drowsy, tracing idle circles on the green-gray skin of her forearm. "It means you are mine now," she said. "Whether you understand the words or not, that is how it works for us." The saying makes it true. She tipped her head to look at him, something vulnerable moving behind the gold of her eyes. "Does that frighten you, Silas Brooks?" "No," he said, and meant it with his whole chest. "It's the first time in a long time I haven't been frightened of anything." He woke to screaming. It was deep in the night. The fire burned down to embers, and Vola was thrashing beside him in the furs, her whole powerful body rigid and fighting some enemy Silas could not see, her hands clawing at the air, at the blankets, at nothing. And the sound coming out of her was a scream unlike anything he had ever heard, raw and desperate, in a language he didn't know, words sharp and guttural, and full of a terror that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Torvash," she screamed, and it tore out of her like something ripping. Torvesh, Nelkioth Raven, Nelkioth Raven. Silas's first instinct was panic, his heart slamming, his hand reaching for her shoulder to shake her awake before he stopped himself, some deeper instinct overriding the first. He had grown up on a farm with a father who woke from war dreams some nights fighting battles a decade gone, and he remembered his mother's iron rule: never grab a man out of a nightmare, you'll only give him a real enemy to fight. So instead of shaking her, he held still. He kept his hands where she could see them if her eyes opened, kept his voice low and steady, and he did not let go of the small bit of blanket he had pulled instinctively toward himself, did not flinch when her flailing arm caught him a glancing blow across the ribs hard enough to bruise. "I'm here," he said, over and over, quiet, even a lighthouse voice in a storm she couldn't see. "I'm here, Vola, you're safe, I'm here." "Shacker," she gasped, and the fight was going out of her now, the words coming slower, broken by sobs that sounded torn from somewhere far too deep. "Shacker, Torvesh Nelkioth Raven Du, Nelkioth." He didn't know what the words meant, but he memorized the shape of them anyway. The sound of her grief pressed into syllables he couldn't translate, because it was the only thing he could do for her in that moment. Hold still and listen and refuse to let go. And somewhere in the deep hours of the night her thrashing slowed and her breathing evened, and she curled into him instead of away, her face pressed to his chest, still murmuring those same broken words into his skin like a prayer she couldn't stop saying even in sleep. He did not sleep again that night. He lay awake with his arms around her, running the sounds over and over in his mind: Torvesh, Nelkioth Raven, Shacker, turning them like stones in his palm, trying to hold their shape until morning, when he might ask her, gently, carefully, what horror lived behind them. Dawn came gray and soft through the cabin's single window. Vola woke slowly, blinking, and Silas watched the moment memory return to her face, watched her go rigid with a fresh kind of fear, not of the nightmare this time, but of him, of what he might have seen, what he might now think of her. "You heard," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had gone flat and careful in a way he recognized now as armor. "I heard." He kept his voice as gentle as he could make it. "I didn't understand the words, Vola, but I didn't let go of you either. I want you to know that. Whatever you were fighting in that dream, I wasn't going anywhere." Something in her seemed to crumple just slightly, the fierce warrior's posture softening into something more raw. "Torvesh means father," she said, so quietly he had to lean in to hear it. "Nelkioth Raven I could not save. Shacker, forgive me." She would not look at him. "It is not a dream, Silas. It is a memory. It comes back to me most nights that I let myself sleep deeply enough to dream at all." "Tell me," he said, "not because I'm owed it. Because I want to understand you, all of you, even the parts that hurt." And so, in the gray dawn light, with the storm past and the world washed clean outside her cabin walls, Vola Thunderroar told him the truth she had carried alone for 3 years. Her father had been Drakner Thunderroar, chieftain of their clan, a war-band leader respected across the eastern territories for his fairness as much as his strength. Vola had been his shield daughter, trained from girlhood to fight at his side, and she had been good at it, better than any of her brothers, fast and fierce, and utterly devoted to the man who had raised her since her mother's death in childbirth. 3 years passed. Their clan had been ambushed in a mountain pass by a rival clan seeking to claim their hunting grounds, a betrayal none of them had seen coming. In the chaos of that fight, Drakner had thrown himself into the path of a spear meant for his daughter's back. "He died shielding me," Vola said, her voice a rasp. "And I could not save him. I fought beside him every day of my life to be strong enough to protect him when it mattered, and when it mattered most, I failed. The clan elders said the strike had been meant for me, that his death was on my hands, that a shield daughter who lets her chieftain die for her has broken the oldest oath our people know. They cast me out. My own brothers would not look at me when I left the camp. I have carried his name and his death every night since, and there has been no one to hold still through the screaming until you." Silas said nothing for a long moment, only reached out and took her hand, and when she let him hold it, he felt something in his chest crack open with a tenderness so fierce it nearly hurt. "That wasn't your fault," he said finally. "A father who loves his daughter will always choose to save her, Vola. That's not a debt you failed to pay. That's a gift he gave you, and I think somewhere under all that grief, you know it too." "I do not know anything anymore," she whispered, "except that I did not think I would ever let another living soul hear those words, and you held still and did not run." "I'm not going to run," he said, and drew her hand up to press his mouth against her knuckles. "Teach me the words, Vola, properly, not just torn out of a nightmare. I want to be able to say them back to you, so you know I understand, even a little." She stared at him like he'd offered her something impossibly precious, and then slowly she began to teach him Torvash, father. Nel Kioth asterisk I could not or I failed. Raven asterisk to save or protect. Shacker, forgive me. And by the time the sun had climbed fully over the ridge, Silas Brooks could say each word back to her cleanly, could say asterisk Nel Kioth Raven. Shacker with an accent rough as river stone, but a sincerity that made her eyes go bright and wet. And when he finished, she pulled him against her and held on like he was the only solid thing left in a world that had tried very hard to take everything else from her. That morning was the true beginning of them, more than the storm, more than the night before. He had learned her nightmare's language by morning, and in doing so he had learned something far more important, the shape of the grief she carried, and the fact that she trusted him enough to let him see it. Winter came and went, and with it came a season Silas would later think of as the happiest of his life, though it was not without its own small dangers and slights. Kestrel's Crossing was a town built on old fears, and though Silas was careful, word travels fast in small border settlements, and it was not long before whispers followed him through the market stalls. The mapmaker and the orc woman, the surveyor and the exile, and worse names besides, spat by men like Odell the blacksmith who had never once bothered to learn Vola's actual name before deciding what to think of her. Vola bore it with a hard, proud silence whenever their paths crossed the town's edges, chin high, refusing to shrink from stares that would have driven a lesser woman to hide. Silas, for his part, found himself standing a little straighter beside her each time, a little more willing to meet a sneering glance with a level one of his own, because he had decided somewhere in that winter that he would rather lose every friendly nod in Kestrel's Crossing than lose one moment of the life he was building with her. They did not marry that winter, not formally, not in the way either the town or her old clan might have recognized. But Vola had begun calling her cabin asterisk their asterisk cabin in unguarded moments, and Silas had begun keeping a second set of surveyor's tools there, so he would not need to ride back to town so often, and something settled and easy had grown up between them that felt, to both of them, like the truest kind of promise, waiting only for the right moment to be spoken aloud in front of witnesses. It was into that fragile, hard-won peace that the trouble came, in early spring, on a morning that began like any other, and ended with the whole of Kestrel's Crossing turned against the woman Silas loved. The dead man's name was Tomas Reed, a rancher who kept land 2 miles north of Vola's cabin, a quiet widower who had never had much use for either orcs or mapmakers, but had never caused Silas or Vola any particular trouble either. He was found by his own hired hand on a gray morning in early spring, sprawled in his own north pasture with a wound in his chest that had, by the time word reached town, become in the retelling a wound made unmistakably by an orc blade, a wide, hooked cut no honest steel from a human forge could make, or so claimed the man who found him, a nervous, weaselly hand named Petrus who worked, as it happened, for a neighboring rancher named Garrick Hale. Garrick Hale had wanted Tomas Reed's water rights for 11 years. Garrick Hale had also, though few in town knew it, tried twice before to buy the parcel of land Vola's cabin sat on, both times refused by the previous owner before Vola had ever arrived, and both times nursing a grudge about it that had never quite cooled. Silas would not learn these particular facts until later. What the town learned first and fastest was simpler and uglier. An orc lived alone on the ridge 2 miles from a dead man, and everyone knew what orcs were capable of. By the time Silas rode into Kestrel's Crossing 3 days after the body was found, the town had already convicted Vola in every conversation held on every porch and in every tavern, and the sheriff, a tired, unimaginative man named Corwin who had never much liked complications, had already ridden out to Bitter Ridge with 4 deputized townsmen to bring her in. Silas found out too late to stop it. He arrived at the town square to find a crowd already gathered, larger than he had ever seen Kestrel's Crossing muster for anything, drawn by the news that the orc woman had been taken. And there, in the center of it, dragged from a wagon with her wrists bound in heavy iron chain far beyond what her crime, if it had been a crime at all, could possibly warrant, stood Vola Thunderroar. She was still in her travel leathers, torn now at one shoulder where a deputy had grabbed her too roughly, her braid coming loose, a bruise darkening along her jaw, but her chin was still high, her amber eyes still burning with a fury that made the nearest townsfolk step back even chained as she was. Silas shoved through the crowd with his heart in his throat, ignoring the mutters and the elbow someone drove into his ribs, until he stood at the edge of the open space around her, close enough that her eyes found his and something in her face cracked, just for a moment from fury into raw relief. "Silas, get back, mapmaker," Sheriff Corwin's voice hard and unhappy cutting between them. "This isn't your business." "She's innocent," Silas said, loud enough to carry over the crowd's ugly murmur. "You've got no proof beyond a wound," some frightened hand claimed looked orc-made. "That's not evidence, Corwin. That's a scared man's guess and a town that wanted someone to blame before the ground was even cold. She lives 2 miles from where Tomas Reed died alone, with no one to say where she was that night," Corwin said. "That's more than most men would need." "I was hunting," Vola said, her voice rough but steady, cutting through the noise. "Alone, as I have hunted alone for 3 years because your town has never once offered me a hand to hunt beside. I did not touch Tomas Reed. I did not know the man, beyond a nod across a fence line." "Convenient, having no one to vouch for you," someone shouted from the crowd, and it was taken up by others, ugly and quick the way fear spreads faster than fact ever can, and Silas watched with rising horror as the mood of the square turned from murmuring suspicion into something closer to a mob, hands reaching for Vola's chains, someone shoving her hard enough that she stumbled despite her strength. Someone else's voice rising above the rest, "Hang her, hang the orc. Let's be done with it before she brings the rest of her kind down on us. Stop." Silas planted himself directly between Vola and the surging crowd, arms spread, and for one dangerous moment he genuinely did not know if they would simply move through him. "You will not do this. Not without a trial, not without a shred of real proof, not while I'm standing here. Move, boy," someone growled, and a hand fisted in his collar to haul him aside, and Vola's roar of fury at that chained, bruised, but still hers, still fighting for him even now, was the loudest sound in the square. "Touch him again and I will show this whole town exactly what an orc is capable of," she snarled, and it was enough, just barely enough, to make the hand let go, though it did nothing to calm the crowd's hunger for a reckoning. Corwin, perhaps sensing how close the square had come to outright violence, perhaps simply wanting the matter settled by someone else's hand, called for order and announced there would be a trial of a rough frontier sort, held before the town's magistrate that very afternoon, evidence to be weighed and a verdict rendered before sundown. It was not justice, as Silas understood the word from books. It was barely more than the mob given a few hours' delay and the appearance of ceremony. But it was hours he intended to use. He rode for Tomas Reed's north pasture before the dust of the town square had settled behind him. He surveyed that pasture the way he had surveyed 100 stretches of wild border country before it, with a mapmaker's patient, merciless eye for detail that panic and prejudice had blinded everyone else to. He found the place where Tomas Reed had fallen, the grass still dark and matted with old blood, and he found, 20 paces from it, half hidden in the mud of the pasture's edge, a set of boot prints that belonged to no orc narrow-heeled, human-made boots, the kind sold at the trading post 2 towns over, and beside them the deeper, dragging print of a horse that had stood still a long while, waiting. He found, snagged on the pasture's barbed fence wire, a scrap of fine gray wool utterly unlike anything Vola owned, unlike anything most ranch hands in the district could afford, the kind of cloth a wealthy man like Garrick Hale might wear beneath his working coat. And when he rode, heart hammering, to the trading post to ask after any recent sales of curved blades of a particular unusual make, the trader remembered clearly selling just such a blade 3 weeks past, a decorative hunting knife, hook-bladed in an Eastern style, meant to mimic the look of orc craft for a customer who had specifically asked for something that would look, in the trader's own words, like it came off an orc. The customer had been Garrick Hale. Silas rode back into Kestrel's crossing with the sun already sliding toward the western ridgeline, the scrap of wool and the trader's sworn word clutched in his saddlebag, and found the square more crowded than before, a rough platform already erected near the old grain store, a rope already thrown over its crossbeam, and Vola Thunderroar standing atop it with her wrists still bound, a noose being fitted around her neck by a deputy who would not meet her eyes. The magistrate's trial had lasted less than an hour. Fear had not needed longer than that to convict her. No. Silas's shout tore out of him before he'd even fully processed what he was seeing, and he drove his heels into his exhausted mare's flanks, sending her crashing through the edge of the crowd, scattering onlookers who cursed and stumbled out of his path. "Stop! Stop this now, you have no right. The trial is done, mapmaker," Corwin called back, though there was something uneasy in his voice now, something that had not been there this morning. The magistrate found her guilty on the weight of what evidence there was. There was no evidence, only fear. Silas flung himself from his still-moving horse, staggering, and shoved through the last of the crowd to the base of the platform. Above him, Vola's eyes had found his, wide now with something that was not fear for herself but a desperate, furious terror for him, for what the crowd might do to him for interfering. "Silas, no, get back, I have proof." He was climbing the platform steps 2 at a time now, ignoring the deputy who moved to block him, shoving past with a strength he did not know he had until that moment. Boot prints that aren't orc-made, a scrap of wool from a coat no rancher's hand could afford. A blade bought 3 weeks past at the trading post, made to look like orc craft, bought by a man who has wanted Tomas Reed's water rights and Vola Thunderroar's land both for over a decade. Garrick Hale killed Tomas Reed and framed her for it, and if you drop that rope you will hang an innocent woman for another man's greed. The square had gone deathly quiet. Somewhere in the crowd, a horse shifted and stamped, loud in the sudden silence. "That's a lie," came a voice from near the platform's edge, and Garrick Hale himself pushed forward, face flushed, hand dropping toward the pistol at his belt, an old, expensive piece, the kind only a wealthy rancher could afford. The mapmaker's addled by that creature. Everyone can see it. He'd say anything to save his orc whore. "Show them the wool, Silas," Vola said, low and urgent, and Silas fumbled the scrap free of his coat with shaking hands even as the deputy beside him, uncertain now, had not yet pulled the lever that would drop the platform beneath her feet. "Show them." Quickly Garrick's pistol cleared its holster. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, though Silas would replay it in his memory for the rest of his life at a speed that felt like hours. Garrick's arm swung up, the pistol's muzzle finding Silas's chest, his finger already tightening on the trigger to silence the one voice that could unravel him. And Vola, bound and noosed, and standing on a gallows platform with death already looped around her throat, threw herself sideways with every ounce of strength left in her powerful frame, her whole body crashing into Silas and knocking him flat off the platform's edge just as the pistol cracked. The shot tearing through the space where his chest had been a heartbeat before, but her lunge had done more than save him. The rope, still tied fast to the crossbeam, snapped taut with brutal suddenness as her weight came against it at an angle the hangman had never accounted for, and the platform beneath her feet, old and poorly built, gave way with a splintering crack. Vola! Silas's scream tore out of him as he hit the ground hard, rolling, already scrambling back up, and the whole square erupted into chaos. Someone screaming, Corwin bellowing for the deputies to seize Garrick Hale, and above it all Vola Thunderroar hung suspended, the rope biting into her throat, her bound hands clawing uselessly at the noose, her powerful legs kicking for a footing that the shattered platform no longer offered. Silas did not think. He would never afterward be able to explain how he crossed the 10 feet between himself and the gallows post so fast, only that he did, vaulting up the broken timbers with a strength born entirely of terror, his surveyor's knife already out of his belt, and he drove the blade up into the taut rope above Vola's head with both hands, sawing with a desperation that turned his vision white at the edges, and the rope parted a half-second before her weight would have finished what the fall had started. And she crashed down into his arms with a force that drove them both to the ground in a tangle of limbs and gasping breath. For one terrible, endless moment she did not move at all, and Silas's whole world narrowed to the desperate press of his fingers against her throat, searching for a pulse, sobbing her name. Then she coughed, a great racking gasp of air dragged back into starved lungs, and her eyes flew open, gold and wild and alive, and she looked up at him with the rope burn already darkening around her throat and said, in a voice like gravel, "You held the knife steady. I felt it did not shake." "It shook plenty," Silas said, laughing and crying at once, cradling her head against his chest while around them the square dissolved into shouting and Corwin's men wrestled Garrick Hale to the ground, the man's confession already spilling out of him in a panicked flood now that his aim had failed and his crime lay exposed before the whole town. "It shook the whole time. I just didn't let it stop me." "Nel Keoth Raven," Vola whispered, and for a moment Silas thought she was slipping back into grief, back into the old nightmare's words, "I could not save," until she managed a broken, exhausted laugh of her own. "I said those words about my father for 3 years. I never thought I would live to have them undone. You saved me, Silas Brooks. You held the knife and you did not run and you saved me." "We saved each other," he said, pressing his lips to her forehead to the rope-burned skin of her throat, careless of the crowd still gathering around them, careless of anything in the world except the fact that she was breathing, she was alive, she was in his arms. "That's how it's always been between us, hasn't it? Ever since the ridge line, we just keep saving each other." Garrick Hale was dragged away in irons before the sun fully set, still protesting, still cursing, though no one in the square found much appetite left to listen to him after watching Vola Thunderroar throw herself into the path of his bullet to save the mapmaker's life. Petrus, his hired hand, broke within the hour under Corwin's questioning and confirmed everything. The false blade purchased to mimic orc craft, the coat Garrick had worn and later burned, the lie about the wound's shape fed to a frightened, credulous town eager for someone else to blame. By full dark, the truth of Tomas Reed's murder belonged to Kestrel's crossing entire, and the shame of what they had nearly done sat heavy and unspoken over the square long after the crowd had dispersed. Silas carried Vola from the wreckage of the gallows platform himself, refusing every offer of help, her arms slung over his shoulders, her weight leaning into him not because she needed the support. She was recovering fast, her orc strength already reasserting itself even as bruises bloomed dark along her throat, but because she wanted to, because for the first time since her father's death she let herself lean on someone else and trust that he would not let her fall. They did not go back to Kestrel's crossing again that week. There was healing to do, and grief besides, for even a wrongful accusation survived leaves its own kind of wound, and Vola spent the first 2 days back at the cabin sleeping more than waking, her voice raw, her throat too bruised for speech beyond a whisper. Silas tended her without being asked, boiling willow bark tea for the pain, sitting beside her through the nights not because he feared another nightmare, Though one did come on the second night, quieter this time, less a scream than a whimper, and he held still through that one too, murmuring asterisk Nel Keoth Raven, shacker back to her in her own tongue until she settled, but because he could not make himself leave her side even for an hour. Not after coming so close to losing her forever on that gallows platform. On the fourth morning, with her voice mostly returned and the rope burn faded to a yellowing bruise, Vola sat up in the furs beside the fire and looked at Silas with an intensity that made him set down the bowl of porridge he'd been stirring. "I have been thinking," she said, "about debts. Vola, if this is about the flour and the honey, it is not about flour." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, quickly gone, replaced by something more solemn. "You saved my life on that platform, Silas. I saved yours on the ridge, and again from Garrick Hale's pistol. We are even now, by any honest reckoning, debt paid, and paid, and paid again between us until neither of us owes the other anything at all." She reached out and took his hand, turning it over to trace the calluses across his palm with one blunt green finger. "I find I do not want us to be even. I do not want a ledger between us that is ever fully settled, Silas Brooks. I want a life where we are always in each other's debt, always choosing to pay it again and again for as long as we both draw breath." Silas's throat had gone tight. "Vola, what are you saying?" "I am saying that among my people, when a warrior chooses to bind her life to another's, she does not ask with flowers or soft words." Vola's grip on his hand tightened, her amber eyes bright and fierce and utterly unguarded, the same eyes that had looked at him across a corpse-strewn clearing a year past and asked asterisk why did I save you at all asterisk without knowing the answer yet. She knew it now. She claims him before witnesses with blade and blood and word, and she does not let go again. I have no clan left to stand witness for me, no elders to bless this, no war band to sing the old songs. But I have you, and I have this ridge, and I find that is enough if you will have it be." "Vola Thunderroar," Silas said, his own voice rough now, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am telling you I intend to claim you," she said, "which is a different and better thing, and I am asking whether you will stand still for it, the way you stood still for my screaming in the dark and learned the words by morning, so that I might know for certain before I do." "I've been standing still for you since the day you put an axe through a man's chest to save my worthless life," Silas said, laughing through the sudden thickness in his throat, pulling her hand up to press against his heart. "I'm not going anywhere, Vola. I never was. Claim me, however your people do it. I want all of it, the blade, the blood, the word, whatever binds us hardest and holds us longest. I choose you. I've chosen you every day since that ridge line, and I'll go on choosing you until I'm an old gray man too stubborn to know better." The claiming was held 3 weeks later, on the ridge above the cabin where they had first spoken as more than stranger and rescuer, at the hour when the sun sat lowest and gilded the whole valley gold. Word had spread through Kestrel's crossing of the truth behind Tomas Reed's death, of Garrick Hale's confession and conviction, and of the orc woman who had thrown herself into a bullet's path to save the mapmaker who loved her. And something in the town's hard heart had shifted in the weeks since. Not fully, not all at once. Prejudice does not unmake itself so easily as that, but enough that a modest handful of Kestrel's crossing folk rode out to the ridge that evening to stand as witnesses. Sheriff Corwin among them, his hat in his hands, his earlier suspicion replaced by something like shame and something like respect both. More remarkable still, 3 riders came down from the eastern passes that same afternoon, orc Silas had never seen before, drawn by word carried on trade routes of a Thunderroar daughter who had cleared her father's death of dishonor at last, who had been vindicated before humans and orcs both by the plain, unshakable fact of her own courage. They were not her brothers. Those bridges, Vola told him quietly, would take longer yet to rebuild, if they could be rebuilt at all, but they were kin of a distant sort, come to see with their own eyes whether the stories were true, and they stayed to stand witness, solemn and watchful at the edge of the gathered crowd. Vola stood before Silas on the ridge top in her travel leathers, the same fitted bodice and dark trousers she had worn the very first day he saw her braid unbound and loose down her back for the ceremony, a single-hand axe held between them in offered palms. Silas took it from her with hands that did not shake this time, and at her soft instruction drew the blade's edge, careful and shallow, across his own palm, and she did the same to hers, and they pressed the wounds together, blood mingling, while she spoke the old words of her people in a voice that carried clear across the ridge. Words Silas did not fully understand yet, though he suspected, from the fierce brightness in her eyes, that he would spend a lifetime learning every one of them. The way he had learned Torvesh and Nelkioth, Raven and Shaker in one long, terrible, beautiful night that had changed everything between them. "I claim you, Silas Brooks," she said in common speech now, so that every witness gathered on that ridge, human and orc both, would understand and could not later say they had not heard it plainly. "Before my kin and yours, before the sky and the stone, I claim you as mine, not because I need a shield at my back, for I have carried my own weight since I was old enough to lift an axe, but because I choose to carry it beside you instead, for every day left to us both. You held still when I screamed in the dark. You learned my grief by morning and gave it back to me gentler than I gave it to you. You held a knife steady when my life hung from a rope, and you have never once looked at me and seen only what my clan or your town told you to see. I love you, Silas Brooks. I will love you when we are old and slow, and I will love you on nights the nightmares come again, and I ask nothing more than that you stand as still for the rest of my life as you did that first night, and let me love you back the same way." Silas's eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it, not before this ridge, not before these witnesses, not before the woman who had chosen him, magnificent and fearless and capable of anything, out of every man in every town and every camp across the whole wide borderlands, and chosen him. "I claim you too, Vola Thunderroar," he said, his voice cracking and steadying by turns. "I'm no warrior. I've got a mapmaker's soft hands and a mapmaker's careful ways, and I never thought a woman like you would look twice at a man like me. But I learned your language in the worst night of your life because I never wanted there to be a single word of your pain I couldn't understand, and I'll go on learning you every day, for as long as you'll let me, your grief and your joy and everything between. I love you. I choose you. Not because I owe you a debt, though I'll gladly go on paying it every day we're given, but because loving you is the truest thing I've ever done, and I don't intend to ever stop." The Eastern Orcs raised a low, wordless chant at that, old and solemn, and Sheriff Corwin, awkward but sincere, led the human witnesses in a rough cheer that Vola later told him, laughing, was nothing at all like a proper orc-claiming song, but which she had loved anyway, because it had been offered freely, by people who had once wanted her dead, and now wanted, however clumsily, to wish her well. They bound their wrists together with a braided leather cord, blood from their joined palms drying dark against the leather, and when Vola pulled him in for the kiss that sealed it, tusks and all, fierce and certain and unhurried, the sun finally dropped below the western ridge and painted the whole sky the color of embers, and Silas Brooks, mapmaker, once a lonely wanderer of wild border country, now and forever claimed, understood at last what it meant to be truly seen, truly wanted, truly chosen by someone who could have had anyone at all, and had reached for him instead again and again, from a ridge-line ambush to a gallows platform to this quiet golden evening, and would go on. Reaching for him, he knew now with a certainty as solid as the stone beneath his feet, for every day that was left to them both. Below the ridge, the little cabin waited, no longer a lonely exile's shelter but a home built for two, its garden turned and growing, its hearth ready for a fire that would never again warm only one heart. Vola Thunderroar led her claimed husband down the slope in the last of the light, her hand wrapped firm and sure around his, and if either of them looked back at all, it was only to see how far they had already come together, and how gladly they meant to go the rest of the way.